Okay, let's do this. So, what are we going to talk about today? I want to discuss something that people often talk around, but they don't talk about directly. And I think more people should talk about this directly. And what I mean by that is more people, like everyday citizens, should talk about this more directly. So, what are we going to discuss today? We're going to discuss the importance of the Rubik's Cube. Okay, just kidding. Just kidding. We're not going to talk about the Rubik's Cube today. But we are going to talk about something that is very important and hopefully not quite as complex, in terms of complexity, should not be viewed as being on the order of the Rubik's Cube. We're going to talk about the law and what the law should mean to us and why we should care about the law as American citizens. And if you're out there listening and you're not American, then first of all, thanks for listening to my videos, and I'm glad you're here. And I still think that a lot of what I talk about in my videos applies to you as well. Even when I talk about the stuff that is specific to the United States, in other indirect ways, it may still apply to you. Okay. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about, United States law, but I still think it would apply to anybody. Okay. So, in talking about the law, let me first explain that I am a proponent of the law. I'm a believer in the law. That does not necessarily mean that I think all of our laws are just or that our system is perfect by any means. Of course, just like everything else, it has been subverted. However, at least in the abstract, I'm a believer in the law, and with our specific legal framework, I do believe that it at least is good insofar as it has not been fully subverted yet. Okay, so it is good, not necessarily perfect. We should try to preserve what we have and even improve upon it, and not let it further deteriorate or become further subverted beyond that which it already has. Okay, so again, the law is good for the most part. Its implementation a lot of times is bad because it's not that we don't have laws or we don't have the right laws. It's that those in power don't follow the law. And here's what's worse: the people often let them get away with it. So people have been concerned about law for a very, very long time, right? Ancient civilizations were concerned about law. They had their own laws. Obviously, even Aristotle said in his treatise on politics that it's better for the law to govern than any, single citizen. Okay. The law should be what's fundamental, not necessarily any one person. The system should be built around laws, not necessarily around a person. Just using myself as an example, when I was in the military, of course, I took an oath to support and defend the Constitution. And that's important because we can draw the distinction there between having an oath to the Constitution, what is considered to be the supreme law of the land, and what would be an oath to a specific person, which of course I, did not take an oath to a specific person, and no other military person, no military service member takes an oath to a specific person. Okay. We are going to come back to that because the two oaths, and this is not really the purpose of my video here today, so I don't really want to go too far into this, but there is a difference between the oath that military officers take and the oath that enlisted service members take. And so if you look at the wording between the two, in the oath that enlisted service members take, it does mention, obeying the orders of the president and even superior officers. So it does mention that. But again, that's not a single specific person by name. It's more, an office, the office of president, or, your superior officers. You got to remember that when you're in the military, the president is the commander in chief. So again, we're not talking about this specific president or that specific president, and whether you do or do not like that person. We're talking about the oath. I'm sorry, about the office of president in this regard, not a specific person. That's kind of the point that I'm making here. So, but in saying that, to kind of drive home this point, I do want to explain something. So I'm going to share something with you guys that I hope will make some sense. So I'm going to share with you the military oath that your those serving in the German military would have taken up until 1933. All right. So from 1919 to 1933, this is the oath that those in the German armed forces would have taken. All right. Listen to this. I'm going to read this. I swear loyalty to the Reich Constitution and vow that I will protect the German nation and its lawful establishment as a brave soldier at any time and will obey the president and my superiors. Now, I will tell you that's fairly similar to the oath that I took, though some of it is a little bit similar to the oath that U.S. enlisted service members take. It's not that different, other than obviously this is, it talks about protecting the German nation, but it mentions the Reich Constitution. So this was the oath that German armed forces service members would have taken between 1919 and 1933. I'm going to read the oath that supplanted that one. All right. So I believe that this was implemented in 1934, but I'm going to read this one. This is the oath that replaced the one that I just read. So this is this oath. I swear by God, this sacred oath, I will render unconditional obedience to Adolf Hitler, the Führer of the German nation and people, supreme commander of the armed forces, and will be ready as a brave soldier to risk my life at any time for this oath. Note the huge difference there. I'm going to read both of those again. This is the first one from 1919 to 1933, the military oath under the Weimar Republic. I swear loyalty to the Reich Constitution and vow that I will protect the German nation and its lawful establishment as a brave soldier at any time and will obey the president and my superiors. That was supplanted by this oath. I swear by God this sacred oath, I will render unconditional obedience to Adolf Hitler, the Führer of the German nation and people, supreme commander of the armed forces, and will be ready as a brave soldier to risk my life at any time for this oath. Okay, so, I mean, what's the clear distinction there? So one, sure, mentions the president, but also mentions, the Constitution. It mentions the German nation. The other mentions a specific individual. You are taking an oath, not just to an office, like the president, but to a specific person. And it's a much more emphatic oath. So anyway, I want to make that distinction because this kind of plays into what we're going to talk about today. So let's talk about the rule of law. Now, if someone says to you, the rule of law, a couple of ideas are probably going to come into your mind. Maybe you're going to think about this idea that the law applies to everyone. No one is above the law. All are equal before the law. And I would say that all those ideas, those are pretty good representations of what the rule of law means. But we're going to look at it a little bit more specifically because we're going to understand how the law should be first and foremost. That's our foundation, not any one specific person, which is why I wanted to explain those two oaths that the German armed forces used to take, and the clear difference in the oath that was specifically oriented towards Adolf Hitler, towards him specifically, not his office that he held, but him, oriented towards the man. And obviously the problems that are inherent to that, right? Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the rule of law and why this is important to us. So I want to share my screen here. Okay, so where am I? I am at United States Court. So this is a This is a government website. So uscourts.gov. So it's an official US website. I will put the link in the description, but this is just an overview on the rule of law. We're just going to read a couple of things here. Now, listen, I am a huge critic of the US government, particularly the federal government. Everyone knows that. So why am I referencing an official website? Because this is what our government kind of officially says that it thinks about the rule of law. So let's not overthink this too much. There's some good information here. Okay. So I'm just going to read a couple of things here. So if you look on this website, and again, I'll put the link in the description below, but what does it say? It says right here, more than 200 years ago, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay published a series of essays promoting the ratification of the United States Constitution, now known as Federalist Papers. So I have a copy of this, the Federalist Papers. Of course, if you're going to read the Federalist Papers, which you should, then you should also read this, the Anti-Federalist Papers. Now, most people, if you're American, you've heard of this. What are these? So they're both a collection of essays. And these are essays that were written that depicted certain ideas that were held at the time of ratification or the ratification debates. So we're talking about the 1780s, the late 1780s. So remember, in the summer of 1787, you had the Philadelphia Convention. They drafted a new constitution, even though that's not what they were there to do. They were supposed to be amending the Articles of Confederation. Instead, they drafted a new constitution. It then went to the states. In the states, they had very fierce ratification debates, and some were arguing in favor of ratifying this new draft constitution, and others opposed it. Those that supported ratification of this new draft constitution were known as the Federalists. Those that opposed it just kind of became known as the Anti-Federalists. They both had a lot of great arguments. And even though the Anti-Federalists argued against ratification, they expressed some pretty significant prescience in foreseeing some of the problems that we're living through right now. And remember, a lot of these guys that were known as Anti-Federalists, they're not enemies of the Constitution or whatever. I mean, yeah, they opposed ratification, but for the most part, they opposed ratification because they didn't think it went far enough in protecting either the sovereignty of the states or the rights of the people. And it was through the efforts of the Anti-Federalists, of course, that we actually got a Bill of Rights. Okay, but anyway, that's not exactly the point of what I want to talk about today. I have talked about that more in a video that I made previously called Am I a Constitutionalist? And I kind of go through, my own thoughts when it comes to the Constitution and even some of the ideas by the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Okay, great. So if you're going to read the Federalist Papers, and you should, because these essays have the arguments of those who were debating in favor of ratifying the Constitution. And of course, the Constitution was ratified. So it's these guys' arguments that kind of held sway for the most part. But that doesn't mean that there weren't significant ideas that were captured in what the Anti-Federalists were saying as well. And some of them brought up some really good points. All right. So let's keep reading here, though. In explaining the need for an independent judiciary, Alexander Hamilton noted in Federalist number 78 that the federal courts, quote, were designed to be an intermediate body between the people and their legislature, unquote, in order to ensure that the people's representatives acted only within the authority given to Congress under the Constitution. So the legislature or the other branches of the federal government can only act within the parameters established by the Constitution. The U.S. Constitution is the nation's fundamental law. It codifies the core values of the people. Courts have the responsibility to interpret the Constitution's meaning as well as the meaning of any laws passed by Congress. Federalist number 78 states further that if any law passed by Congress conflicts with the Constitution ought to be preferred to the statute, the intention of the people to the intention of their agents. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land. And if a law is passed that conflicts with the Constitution, then which one is superior? The Constitution, not this law that conflicts with it. Because the Constitution is supposed to reflect, according to Hamilton, the will of the people, as opposed to the representatives of the people who try to pass this law. All right. So I'm going to open up Federalist 78 that is quoted twice here on this website. Now, this site is talking specifically about Congress. Why? Because it's UnitedStatesCourts.gov. So this website, which is an official government website, but it is specific to certain issues here. So it doesn't matter that we're only talking about, for example, like Congress, or even that we're talking about the judiciary. It doesn't matter, because what we're saying here also applies to the executive. That's kind of my point here. All right. So I'm reading here in this book on page 466, if you have this edition, but whatever, it doesn't matter. It's in essay number 78. So Federalist 78. So I'm reading here. This was written by Alexander Hamilton. I'm not the biggest fan of Alexander Hamilton. I think he was actually quite problematic. I think he's a very, very smart guy, but I do think he was quite problematic. But that doesn't mean that he was always wrong. He did say some things that I do think were correct. He just also said a lot of things that were problematic. But anyway, so I'm quoting him here. No legislative act, therefore, contrary to the Constitution, can be valid. To deny this would be to affirm that the deputy is greater than his principal, that the servant is above his master, that the representatives of the people are superior to the people themselves, that men acting by virtue of powers may do not only what their powers do not authorize, but what they forbid. And then in the next paragraph, part of the way through the paragraph, he says, a constitution is, in fact, and must be regarded by the judges as a fundamental law. Now, Hamilton here is talking about the judges, because Federalist 78 is about the judiciary department. So, whatever. All right. So again, whether we're talking about the judiciary or whether we're talking about the legislature, it also applies to the executive, because the president is also a representative of the people, which means he's an agent of the people. He's not greater than the people. All right. As Hamilton said there. And this is important, because the rule of law is about the supremacy of the law. And what's the most fundamental law? The supreme law of the land, the Constitution. Okay, so let's just go down. I'm going to skip down here to this paragraph right here. The American democratic system is not always based upon simple majority rule. There are certain principles that are so important to the nation that the majority has agreed not to interfere in these areas. For instance, the Bill of Rights was passed because concepts such as freedom of religion, speech, equal treatment, and due process of law were deemed so important that, barring a constitutional amendment, not even a majority should be allowed to change them. Rule of law is a principle under which all persons, institutions, and entities are accountable to laws that are publicly promulgated, equally enforced, independently adjudicated, and consistent with international human rights principles. Okay, what does that mean? The law applies to everyone. Does it apply to the president? Yes, of course. All right. Does it apply to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court? Yes, of course. Does it apply to you? Does it apply to me? Yes. All right. Equally enforced, publicly promulgated. You can't have secret laws. Okay, that violates the whole notion of there being a law, and the law being the foundation of our system. All right. So let's address something, because I know some people might think about this. So, somebody might say, okay, but what's the law based on? Aren't God's laws higher than man's laws? Well, yes, of course they are. And I am not here to tell you that our system is perfect. I'm not here to say that. So our, our sense of morality should be captured in our laws. So your law is not an independent system. It's nested within a certain political philosophy held by the people. And even that political philosophy is going to be nested within certain cultural underpinnings, some of which are going to be theological, because everybody has a cosmology, even if you're an atheist. Okay. So collectively, the law, I mean, it doesn't just emerge ex nihilo. It comes from somewhere, right? So if you want your law to be just, then what feeds into that system to ensure that it's just, that it is based in a system of morals that the people possess in common, or hopefully. And when they don't share a culture, then of course that's when you're going to run into problems, because then it can be difficult to implement a system of laws that everyone agrees upon, right? Because you want buy-in. Why? Because then everyone says, yeah, we want these laws to be enforced because we're going to follow them. And then when people don't follow them, there will be accountability, there will be justice, the laws have to be enforced, etc. All right, so let's go on and let's share one more thing here, right? So I'm going to share something from the next source that I got that I just want to go through quickly. And this is, all right, so this is from the American Bar Association. So listen, I'm not here to tell you that I'm a big fan of like the American Bar Association, or that I think, our system of judges and lawyers always get it right. I'm not telling you that whole corpus of people has not been infiltrated, and our law has not been subverted. Of course it has. I'm not naive. Okay. So I'm not telling you that I'm a huge fan of the American Bar Association, but I'm also not here to tell you that it's not like a recognized authority, because of course to some degree that it is. So for our purposes today, I think it's worth it for us to at least look at what the American Bar Association says about the rule of law. We don't have to overthink this, okay? All right, what is the rule of law? The rule of law is a term that is often used but difficult to define. A frequently heard saying is that the rule of law means the government of law, not men. What did we say Aristotle said? It's better that the law governs and not, any citizen, right? Or any one citizen. But what is meant by a government of law, not men? Aren't laws made by men and women in their roles as legislators? Don't men and women enforce the law as police officers or interpret the law as judges? And don't all of us choose to follow or not to follow the law as we go about our daily lives? How does the rule of law exist independently from the people who make it, interpret it, and live it? The easiest answer to these questions is that the rule of law cannot ever be entirely separate from the people who make up our government and our society. The rule of law is more an ideal that we strive to achieve, but sometimes fail to live up to. Sure, there's no society perfectly adheres to the rule of law, but collectively we strive to. We should, as a country, as a society, we should be seeking to live in a way that, of course, is in accordance with our system of laws that promulgates, just and right living. The idea of the rule of law has been around a long time. Many societies, including our own, have developed institutions and procedures to try to make the rule of law a reality. These institutions and procedures have contributed to the definition of what makes up the rule of law and what is necessary to achieve it. All right, good. So, I'm going to put this I'll put this link right here in the description so you guys can come here and you can read through more of this. We're not going to go, through all of this, but I do want to read a little bit more. All right, so James Madison's quote from the Federalist Papers. I forgot to read the quote. All right, let me read this quote. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this: you must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. All right, you got to think about that a little bit. All right. James Madison quote, that's from Federalist number 51, by the way. James Madison's quote from the Federalist Papers gets at the heart of the problem that even a government of law is ultimately administered by men over men. The framers of the U.S. Constitution addressed this problem by dividing power among the different branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial. This framework for government, known as the separation of powers, ensures that no one person is able to gain absolute power and stand above the law. Each branch of our government has some level of control or oversight over the actions of the other branches. Okay, so you guys, if you ever took a high school civics class or whatever, then you've certainly heard this. And believe me, I interact with a lot of people, and I'm like, I mean, did you ever take a civics class in high school? I mean, do you not understand this? And because it boggles my mind sometimes. And I'm not talking about, kind of nameless, faceless people on social media. That's not even what I'm talking about, though. Believe me, they're there too. But I'm talking about real people that I know, that I have discussions with, because they're, friends of mine or whatever, or just, people that I interact with, but real people. And a lot of people out there don't necessarily have a great grasp of these things. And that's a real shame. So we have to understand limited government. We have to understand the separation of powers. We have to understand the system of checks and balances. We also have to understand that the states created the federal government. I mean, there's this idea of federalism. It's like this bedrock principle of what our nation was founded upon. And a lot of people don't necessarily know what federalism means. But so the states do not work for the federal government. Your governor does not work for the president. And if you think that, like, even in any way, that is completely wrong. But not only is it wrong, it's a dangerous way to think. So this leads me kind of to what I really want to talk about today. Too many people are focused in a lateral type way, when it comes to problems, rather than thinking in a more vertical way. Now, when I say that, I'm kind of going against what I just said. I just said, the states don't work for the federal government. They created the federal government. Okay, but let's just set that aside just for a moment, even though that is the correct way to think. Okay, so here's what I mean when I say people often think laterally, and they want to fight laterally when they should be thinking more vertically. Okay, here's what I mean. You got these two political parties, and if you're familiar with anything that I say, then you know that I believe that the political parties are largely fake. And people fall into this dialectical trap of always blaming the other side. There's almost like a little bit of tribalism that comes along with it. I'm a Republican, or I'm a Democrat, or whatever. And so I have to support everything that, my tribe does, and oppose everything that the other tribe does. And that system gets us nowhere. Okay. It's, people talk about the two parties being, the two wings of the same bird or whatever, or like, I don't know, the two wheels of a bicycle. You get on the bike, the next thing you know, the bike takes you in a direction that you don't even necessarily want to go, right? So that's kind of what happens. So this dialectical system and this kind of, fighting back and forth allows the agenda to always move forward. I've talked a lot about this in other videos. So if you're interested, you can go check out a video that I made over a year ago called "Stop Blaming the Left." And that's kind of targeted towards conservatives and saying, like break out of this engineered dialectical construct. There are better ways to approach this. But if you're on the left and you're doing the same thing towards the right, then that same video would apply to you. I was just kind of orienting it towards, conservatives. But here's a specific way in which this is problematic. Okay. So you get this anytime so one of the ways in which these engineered dialectics work is they kind of create like a strategy of tension. You ever heard about that? Why? Because then there's natural tension between the two sides of whatever the dialectic is, whether it's kind of Republicans and Democrats, which is kind of what I'm referring to here. But these constructed dialectics work in a variety of ways. Another video you could check out where I talk about this is I talk about this in Seeing Through Rigged Games. I also talk about this in a video that I did called Wolves, Sheep, and the Counterespionage Mindset. All right. Anyway, so, but I want to talk about a specific problem that I see. I see people who support actions that are being done by their side when they shouldn't, just because they're actions that are coming from their side. You can't support tyranny just because it comes from your side. And if your response to that is, yeah, but the other side did it, then this is the exact problem that I'm talking about. Constantly pointing fingers at the other side is fighting laterally when our problems are not those to the left and, or right of us, but those, that's where I'm talking about kind of the vertical construct, which I don't necessarily like thinking that the federal government is above us per se, but just from, making my point, I think you guys understand the distinction that I'm making between the left and the right fighting each other when we should be fighting those in power above us. That's what I mean by, vertically. Again, the states do not work for the federal government. If you think they do, you're wrong. And that kind of thinking is dangerous. Okay, so you can't support what your guy does just because he's your guy. If what he's doing is wrong or illegal or unconstitutional. So we're going to kind of talk about that. And this applies to everybody. I'm not talking about any one specific person or whatever. You can apply this where you think it needs to be applied. The legal status of an action is not predicated upon who the actor is. Okay? But this is the way that a lot of people think. Most people think personality first. So let's just talk about the president. Okay? It doesn't matter which president we're talking about or when. But let's say the president is going to implement a policy. So a lot of people, what's kind of the first thing that they think about in their mind? Well, do I like the president? Is the president my guy? Did I vote for him? Do I support him? And if the answer is yes, then the next question is, well, do I like this specific policy? But a lot of people don't even go that far. If they like the guy, they support the guy, then a lot of them just go straight to, oh, well, I support this policy, even if they don't even think to any real degree about what that policy necessarily means. And a lot of them never even get to the question of, well, is that action even lawful? Is it authorized for the president to do? Now, I'm talking about the president just because that's an easy example. I'm not mentioning any specific president or whatever. This isn't oriented towards, it doesn't matter. But we also could talk about this, not even just in terms of the president. I'm just using that because it's a very clear example. So a lot of people think in terms of personalities first. Do I like this guy? Did I vote for him? Do I support him? Am I on his team? Then maybe they think about, the value of the policy, the utility of the policy. And then they may never even get to the question of where it's legal, unless they don't like the guy. In which case, then if they think it's illegal, they will certainly point and shout, that's illegal, or that's unconstitutional. But they would let their guy get away with it. And that's a problem. Because if you let your side get away with it, then you are allowing the federal government to arrogate more power into itself. And then it grows. It consolidates more power into itself. It grows. It expands. And what happens? You're diminishing the power at the level of the states and the people. Okay, you're taking power away from the states and the people. Okay, so let's before I move forward, let me make a quick point here, right? Have you read the Constitution? If you have never read the Constitution, please do that. Homework assignment. Our Constitution is famously short. I don't think it's the shortest one, out there in the world. But I do believe that it's one of the shortest ones. And I believe, if I remember correctly, I think it's about 4,500 words. The average American adult can probably read the Constitution in less than 1 hour. The whole thing, the full text of the Constitution, less than 1 hour, even with the because I'm not saying it's a super easy document to read because some of the language is a little bit difficult. I got it. I understand that. Maybe some of the terminology is slightly arcane. I get it. But it is short. So in that regard, it is easy to read. But if you care about your rights, and if you don't, you're wrong, and you're part of the problem. So if you care about your rights and you care about the law, read the Constitution. Just read it. Homework assignment if you've never done that. And if you have done it, maybe it wouldn't hurt to read it again. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we are going to look at a very simple little series of questions here dealing with the law, or legality, and then maybe like what we could call maybe the utility of a certain policy. Okay, so is it a good policy? Would it be helpful? Would it be useful? Is it sensible? So the word that I'm going to use is utility. So here's what we're going to do. So all right. Okay, you guys see this here? All right, this is my little this is like my legal Rubik's Cube here. Okay, that's kind of where I got that joke from. Okay, because it kind of looks like one, right? All right, but it should be much less complex. Okay, friends, what are we looking at? I just made this super, super simple, like down and dirty 2x2 matrix. What are we looking at here? Okay, we have two questions about policy, whatever policy X. Okay, is it legal? Like, is it constitutional? Let's just say the president is going to implement a policy. So we could say, okay, is it constitutional? So in that regard, does he have the authority to do that? Okay, so one question is it legal? All right, so that's kind of where you have legality. Plus sign means yes, it's legal. The the minus sign here, the negative, means it's not legal. And over here you have utility. So that's just the word that I'm using to mean, would it be a good policy? Is it sensible? Is it useful? So the word that I'm using to mean that is utility. I'm just using that in like just the basic meaning of the word. I'm not in any way applying it in the way that somebody might think of the philosophy or the philosophical meaning of utilitarianism. That's not necessarily what we're talking about, though obviously that's also derived from the word utility. But I just mean here, I was looking for a word that just means, does it make sense? Would it be a good policy? All right, utility. So if the answer is yes, it's a good policy, it makes sense, plus sign. If it's no, not a good policy, not useful, then I just, minus sign. All right, very simple. So you look at our given policy X. Let's say it's both legal and useful, has legality and utility, plus sign, plus sign. Okay, easy. So yeah, you can implement it. Like, yeah, okay, great. Green, go. So this is an easy one. Well, here's another one that's an easy one. Okay, you look at our given policy X. Well, what if it is both illegal, okay, illegal, and like unuseful? It doesn't have utility, or it has, negative utility. Well, this is also an easy answer. Like, hey, that would be a bad policy all around because it doesn't make sense. It wouldn't work, but it's also illegal. Like in our case with the president doesn't have the authority to implement policy X. Okay, great. But here's where it gets a little bit trickier. So let's talk about this one. Okay, so in this case, all right, what's going on here? Well, we have a minus sign and a plus sign. So what does this mean? It means that it's an unuseful policy, but it is legal. So why did I put it in orange here as opposed to red? So this one is like, bad policy all around, should have never even been considered. This is an easy answer, just as this is an easy answer, because this is a clear go and this is a clear no go. Well, what about this one? So it's legal. So legally, you could implement the policy. But at least for what we're saying here, it's a bad idea. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't have utility. So, yeah, it might be legal, but why would you do it? Just from a policy standpoint. Okay, that's why I put it in orange. So, what about this one? So, this one, and this is the one that we need to talk about. So, this one, the plus sign here means there is utility. It's a good policy. It makes sense. It might be helpful, but it's illegal. Or in this case, the president, just again, using this example, does not have the legal authority to be able to implement that policy. The Constitution does not grant him that authority in this case. So what happened? What happens? This is the tricky one. All right. So this, easy answer. This, easy answer. This, maybe not quite as easy an answer as these, but if it's legal but doesn't really have, much utility, or negative utility, then, it's not that hard of an answer. But what about this one? Could be a good idea, but it's illegal. So what happens? All right. It's a good idea, but it's illegal. All right. So anyway, we're going to continue to talk about this, but I'm gonna shut this down. I'm gonna get off this screen here. But again, just a very simple 2x2 matrix talking about legality, utility. Clearly, I'm not the first person to think in this type way. I know I'm taking something that is very complex and I'm boiling it down to make it simple, but here's why. I'm not trying to be overly reductive, but here's the thing. At the end of the day, for a lot of these policies, you can reduce it down to the question of, is it legal? Which is totally separate and distinct from, is it otherwise a good policy? Now, you might say, well, yeah, but if it's illegal, then maybe it's not a good policy. Well, yeah, that's kind of the position that I'm taking here. But for my purposes here, I'm drawing a clear distinction between those two, okay? For our purposes here, so that we can talk about these two categories distinct from one another, if that makes sense. So again, what we're going to talk about is what happens when there is a policy that is perhaps a good idea, but is illegal. All right. So, like I just said, right? I'm not trying to be like overly reductive here, because I know that I'm taking something complex and I'm simplifying it. But that's because the specific point that I'm trying to make, I think, is fairly simple. And so in that regard, we can kind of cut through some of the complexity and at least focus on this simple point. Because I think with a lot of these issues, you can get to the legal part and you can say, is this legal? Now, that's not always a super simple question, but at least if you focus just on the legality and you get rid of the other stuff, then you're focusing singularly on that issue. Even if there is some complexity specific to that issue itself. But remember, the law is meant to be clearly understood. I'm not saying it always results to be that way, but the law should be clearly understood, because when everyone understands it, then there's buy-in, but also then people can follow it and it can be enforced. Otherwise, if it's not clearly understood, how can you hold people accountable for something that is unclear? Yeah, that's not necessarily very just. Okay. Back to our question of utility versus legality. Now, there's something else I know we need to address. So one of those conditions is fairly objective and the other much less so. All right. So I understand sometimes the law is not always clear, but ideally you can get to a very clear yes, no. You may have to dig a little bit, but you can get to a yes, no answer on the question of, is this legal? Yes or no. All right. So that's why I'm saying it's fairly objective compared to the other. With the condition of utility, well, sometimes it's hard to quantify ahead of time because there may be both positive and negative effects inherent to our policy X that we're talking about. Because maybe this policy, if implemented, it's going to produce, some things good and some things not so good, and it's going to elicit a variety of opinions about it. Sure. So I understand it's not necessarily super easy to measure, but I think you guys can at least follow the logic that I'm trying to establish here, right? The law is fundamental, okay, and should be clearly understood. Now, I'm going to ask a question, and this goes back to kind of utility versus legality. Do the ends justify the means? Now, you and I may have different personal answers to that question. I am not an ends justify the means kind of person. Our founding fathers were not ends justify the means kind of people. Remember, the idea of natural rights and our founding documents are kind of built on this idea of natural rights. Natural rights are granted by God. Now, our Declaration of Independence, which of course, precedes the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence states that the people are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Now, remember, what does that mean? It means governments don't give you your rights. God does. Governments are instituted by people in order to safeguard their rights. Your rights do not come from the government. They come from God. The government protects those rights. That's why we believe in limited government, separation of powers, a system of checks and balances, etc. So, according to our founding documents, our legal framework, no, the end or utility achieved does not justify any means whatsoever, perhaps even illegal, used to accomplish that means. Let me say that again. So, no, according to our legal framework, the end, aka the utility achieved, does not justify the means, perhaps even illegal, by which we accomplish that end or we accomplish that utility. Okay? So it's important that we understand this. And if you're questioning me, like, just go study up on natural law or whatever. And regardless of your personal opinions on natural law, at least understand what the founders' opinions were when it comes to natural law. Because remember, our Constitution doesn't grant a whole lot of exceptions. Well, you can't do this except for here, here, and here. Now, can our Constitution be changed? Yes, of course, there's an amendment process, yeah, of course. But we don't suspend our Constitution in situations of emergency. We don't. Because once you do that, good luck getting those constitutional protections back in place. All right. So remember, so I tend to err on the side of the law, right? So we've got, legality and utility. We got maybe this conflict, or maybe there's some tension between the two, right? Well, I tend to err on the side of the law. Now, you could accuse me of being biased towards the law, but here's the deal. And you may say, yeah, but I appeal to something higher than the law. That's fine. Listen, I'm a believer in God too. And so I'm just using that as an example. So if you're going to tell me that you believe that God's ways are higher than our ways, God's law is higher than our law instituted by man, I would agree with you all day long. But again, the law isn't arbitrary. This goes back to the point that I made earlier. Our law should be nested within it, those moral principles be enshrined within our law. Our law isn't arbitrary. It doesn't exist independent of some political philosophy. And there are going to be certain pillars of that political philosophy. Some of them may even be theological. Again, depends on what culture and society we're talking about, right? To include our own. So if utility and legality are in conflict, what do? Well, here's what we don't do. We don't ignore the law. That's what tyrants do. And it's what ignorant citizens allow. Period. Full stop. If that's you, sorry, you're the problem. Ignorance comes with consequences. Societal naivete and civic ignorance are twin killers. They are. They are. History is replete with examples. So you could say, well, maybe the law should be addressed. Maybe the law should be changed. And that could be a helpful approach. You know, you could say, well, why doesn't the law allow this? Well, then let's address that. Maybe the problem is the law for whatever reason. It could be a variety of reasons. But let's address that rather than ignoring it. Okay. It's important that we understand both of these categories and that, yes, they're related, but they're still separate and distinct from one another. Because here's the deal. You know, sometimes when you're having discussions with your friends or I don't know, whatever, you'll be talking about maybe you're talking about a specific policy, just to continue with our example. Because this happens to me. And I'll say, hey, but you know that's illegal. Like the president can't legally do that. And somebody might respond to that comment by me. Let's say I say that. They might respond to me and deflect from the legality and talk to the utility. Yeah, but we have to because of this. Or they'll point to the problem. Well, yeah, but if we don't implement policy X, then how do we solve this problem? Okay, so here's the issue with that. When I mention the legality of the issue and someone points either directly to the utility of the issue, the utility of the policy, or they point indirectly to the utility of the issue by pointing to the problem, because, and this is probably getting a little bit difficult for me to explain here, but like if I'm talking about the legality and I'm in a discussion with you and you mention the utility, you deflect and mention the utility, we're now talking about two different things. That's what I'm trying to explain. But there are two different ways that people might deflect from the legality and focus on the utility. One is a direct way and one is an indirect way. So if I mention the legality and you directly mention the utility, yeah, but this policy would be so good for this, then you have deflected from legality and redirected to the utility. But there's another way in which you could do that a little bit more circuitously. So I mention the legality and you deflect from the legality and you focus indirectly on the utility, but you do it by mentioning the problem. Yeah, but if we don't implement, policy X, then how are we going to solve the problem? Blah, 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 blah. Which is still kind of reorienting around the utility. You're just doing it in a less direct way. All right. So what's my problem here? I'm talking about the legality of the issue and you're still talking about the utility. All right. That's the way I'm trying to frame this discussion. The utility has nothing to do with the legality. That's kind of my central point here. And I'm probably just rambling on and on. And I do admit that this stuff gets tricky, So I get it. I totally understand it. But we have to address these issues because we have a lot of societal naivete and civic ignorance. And I just feel like that's a recipe for disaster. And I do feel like when I said, hey, those are, twin killers of civilization or, whatever, twin killers of nations. And I do believe that history is replete with examples. Tyrants ignore the law, and ignorant citizens allow it. And unfortunately, right now, I do believe that we have a nation of ignorant citizens. So I don't want to be an ignorant citizen. You don't want to be an ignorant citizen. So when I say that, like, I want to point fingers at people. So let's all, speaking about everybody, myself included, let's not be ignorant. The rule of law is important. And one of the ways in which we protect ourselves from tyranny is to understand the law. You don't have to be a legal scholar. I'm not a legal scholar. I'm not a legal scholar. I'm not a lawyer. I haven't been to law school or, whatever. But I periodically read through the Constitution. That doesn't mean that periodically I literally read the entire text or whatever, like all the time. I have read the Constitution, and I periodically read through, sections of it, particularly when I have a specific question. So my point here is, a lot of times issues come up and everyone points to, is that a good or bad policy decision? And they totally dismiss the question of the law or the constitutionality of that. And that's separate and distinct from whether or not it is otherwise a good policy. Now, they're both important, but in my mind, the fact that it is otherwise potentially a useful policy does not obviate the legal requirement. It still has to be legal, because if you allow your side, your guy, to do things that are outside of, the constitutional parameters, then you have just permitted the aggrandization of the office of the president. Just to continue with our example. So then when someone else is in that office that you don't like, well, guess what? Their powers have become a little bit more enlarged from what they were, and you helped contribute to that. So when you give up power, don't be surprised when down the road, potentially by somebody else, that is used against you. That's kind of my central point. So I'm not orienting this towards any specific president. I'm not talking about, any specific policy. In a later video, I may talk more specifically where we could look at an example of this and we could talk about it. Right here, I wanted to be a little bit more general, and I know I'm maybe speaking a little bit more abstractly, because that's kind of my point. I'm trying to talk about the principle of the matter and in general terms. So I hope this made some sense. I do feel like I was kind of rambling a little bit, so hopefully I didn't lose everybody out there. I may have. I was hoping it would not be quite as complex as the Rubik's Cube here, which was created by a Hungarian architect named Rubik, obviously. All right. Hey, thanks for sticking there with me. I appreciate it. This stuff is important. And I hope this was helpful and that I didn't ramble too much. Let me know what I left out, or let me know some of your thoughts on this. And if you guys thought my little 2x2 matrix was helpful, maybe not, my little legal Rubik's Cube there. And let me know what your thoughts are. Give me some comments, and I will catch you guys next time.